We are committed to creating a safe and supportive space for our guests and listeners, and to provide information and tools that will help our listeners understand, manage, and overcome trauma. We understand that the healing journey can bring up challenging emotions. Therefore, we want to warn our audience that certain episodes may contain discussions or stories that could be triggering for some individuals. The content of the podcast is for educational and informative purposes only, and we encourage you to practice self-care and discretion while listening, and to reach out to a trusted support system or professional if you feel overwhelmed and need help on your healing journey. Welcome back, everyone, to Healing and Growing Hand in Hand podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Tickle, and our guest today is Kathryn Berg, and she specializes in helping people overcome PTSD using homeopathic methods, which I think is really cool. We had a really interesting pre-podcast meeting. It was really, really interesting. And then you're going to share your background and just some client stories and stuff and tell us more about what you do.
Okay. Thanks for having me on, Lisa. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you and to let your listeners know about homeopathy and how it can help with PTSD. I have been a homeopath for over 20 years, and I graduated from the Northwestern Academy of Homeopathy here in Minneapolis, where I live. I live in St. Paul, but anyway, it's so I've been practicing for a very long time, and only recently I got to thinking about what is it that people struggle with that if there would be no solution for them. I just couldn't bear to have that go unsolved. And I think about, for example, the military and all of the military suicides each and every day, you know, around 20.
It's a crisis.
That's just not acceptable. It is a crisis. You're absolutely right. And so I did a study that included 15 to 20 people from all over the country. And I wanted to see if homeopathy could help PTSD. So it was kind of more of a preliminary study than what one would call an official study. And I treated these people for no charge, with the exception of the remedies, and sent them remedies. And we had follow-ups every 4 weeks for about 4 to 5 months. And, you know, the results were outstanding.
Boy, that had to feel good.
So I can share some of those stories with you today. Yes, it really did. And you know, what it helped me do was narrow it down a little bit and see some categories. And there are categories of military, of course, and first responders, and a lot of those remedies overlap, as you can imagine. And then there's civilians who have PTSD. And then the civilians, you know, kind of overlaps into this concept of CPTSD, which is complex or chronic. Some people call it one thing, some people call it another. And that's a lot more.
So why don't you share the difference between those, just so our listeners know?
Sure. So most people think of PTSD as having, you know, an episode or 2 or 3 of something that is very traumatic for you. And when we think of military, you know, it's generally something like a near-death experience. But it could also be that somebody you are responsible for, maybe you gave the orders and people died because of the orders that you gave. So that's, you know, a whole different way of experiencing PTSD. And there's a lot of guilt involved with that and a lot of grief.
Yeah.
As you can imagine. So the second category I mentioned was first responders. And the first responders are people who, like police officers and ambulance drivers, EMTs, those kinds of things. And they're always meeting up with people on those people's worst day of their lives. And that really takes a toll on the first responders. And in fact, one of my really good testimonials that I have on my website is a video testimonial from one of the first responders who participated in the study. And I can talk about that. And then finally, there's the civilians. And, the civilians can be any number of things. One of them can certainly be, a near death experience too, like an automobile. I remember one client I had one time, and, we were talking about things, and she's just getting ready to leave. This happens in homeopathy a lot. You hear a lot in the last 5 minutes of a homeopathy appointment. And she says, well, I'm still feeling anxious about that car incident. And I'm like, what car incident? she hadn't told me about it. And she said, well, I almost I almost got hit on the highway. And, it was just, it could have been tragic if she had been, it was definitely a near death experience for her. And she was just still so anxious she could hardly drive. And there is a remedy that works for this almost every time. And it's called aconite. And, people can go and get a mild potency of that in the store, but you can also probably need a stronger one for something like that. And she took a dose of it, and all of that went away within a couple of days. And then we were able to continue with her other symptoms. But sometimes this layer will come on,
Right. And
then
it's kind of temporary.
And then, yeah. And then, one of the other common ones is a traumatic birth experience. And that can be a source of PTSD. And of course, something happening to your child, something happening to one of your parents. And again, some of the grief and the guilt can come from that too.
So I got completely sidetracked. I got so involved in what you were saying, I completely forgot what I was going to ask. I guess why don't you so tell us some of the different, because you just described something that someone could take for if they were having a hard time or having fear of driving a car or that, right? So
Right.
some of the other stuff that you would do, like, I mean, a lot of course, what I deal with, and I'm sure you deal with too, is the childhood abuse trauma and that arena. And that's so layered and complex too, right? And for people who like me, I'm 60 years old, so I've been dealing with it for a long time. So what kind of remedies are out there for that?
Okay. Well, there are potentially hundreds.
Of course there is.
because as you said, it's so layered and so complex. For example, in one of my study participants, he had a combination of military PTSD and childhood PTSD. So one could say that he was very susceptible to the military PTSD going into it because he already had so much trauma in his life. And so his incident in the military was that he stumbled onto one of his other people who were signed up with him, and they were in basic training, who had committed suicide. And so he stumbled into that fight. He's the one who found the body. But he had just so much trouble. I mean, his therapist had told him it was the worst case of childhood trauma he'd ever witnessed in a patient before. And I ended up giving him, there's remedies from the last row of the periodic table that are all about not having joy in your life and feeling like if you don't hold it together, everything's going to fall apart. So you can imagine that those remedies would be really helpful if that's how people feel about their trauma. But if they have different emotions about their trauma, like they're angry, that would be a different set of remedies.
Yeah, because I can see how it'd be layered, and I'm sure as you kind of work through one, other things can pop up, and so that prescription might change, or that the remedies may change to fit that particular scenario that they're going through at the moment. Because I know for me, it's been layers. It's totally been layers, and as one layer kind of lifts up, it exposes more, and it just it's kind of like that whole onion thing they talk about. It's layers.
Exactly. And I even had a person in the research study who was who had that layer show up during the study. So she was doing really well, and all of a sudden, it was an anniversary of somebody who had died, who was like a
Mm-hmm.
mentor for her, and she um, just couldn't handle it, and so and she had got some physical symptoms, which was the thing that actually tipped us off, is that she got some physical symptoms from it. And so I looked at those, and I'm like, so what else is going on? And she told me then, oh, well, this is an anniversary, and then so we switched and we dealt with that grief
So it's
lane.
like it bubbles up to the surface
And
almost, right?
it does. It's exactly like bubbling up to the surface. Once we healed that, then we were able to go back to the other remedy, and it continued.
So they take
The one I
so
had
they
first
take this
given.
remedy. Is it for a certain amount of time until they feel better? I mean, how does that work? Because that's really interesting. Because it's very different, obviously, than
Yes.
prescription medication, right? Where you're on medication, you're on it forever,
Right.
pretty much. But here it sounds like you take it
Yeah,
while
right.
you're working through a trauma incident or something, and then you take it off and then you change it to something else.
Exactly. If there are layers in there, that's exactly what happens. And, my goal is always to heal people, but, there can be incidents that come up that trip you up,
Mhm.
and, you require to repeat the remedy. Or the remedy is energy. And if you burn through the energy because of, maybe it's Christmas, and we all know how some people get really
Mhm.
stressed out about family events and that sort of thing. So then you might find yourself under certain circumstances having to repeat them.
Right. I mean, because really, it's a healing journey, right? So it's a journey,
is.
and we don't
It
know
is.
sometimes what's going to trigger us. We're going. I know if you don't
Right.
have any warning that there's a trigger coming, and I know for me, when the one trigger I'm thinking about, I didn't see it coming at all. It came out of completely left field, and so
Mhm.
you can't always prepare for that. And so I don't. I always like to tell people it is a journey. I'm on this journey until I take my last breath, and so sometimes you do need to go back in and need a little help with something, right?
Right. Or maybe it's like, I better call my homeopath because something's going on here and this remedy isn't
Right.
working for me.
And that's where self-awareness would come in really handy, because paying attention to
Yes.
what's going on in your body and paying attention to what you're thinking and how you're feeling, is always the indicator that you need to pay attention to, because your body's trying to tell you something.
Yes.
So tell us some more successful stories, because I find these really fascinating. You told me a few on the pre-interview that were really interesting.
Okay. So I had one military man who was he was having dreams about being caught without a weapon. And the reason he was having those dreams is because it actually happened to him. And so I first gave him this aconite remedy, and it helped a little bit, but I felt like it just wasn't quite right. So I found a remedy that I had learned about in a class I had taken many years before that, and I had just decided that someday I was going to need that, and I put it in my head. I remembered that remedy, and it's a really interesting remedy. So there's these are all remedies from the nightshade family. So we think about tomatoes and potatoes and peppers and that kind of thing, and those are all, by the way, turned into homeopathic remedies too. But there are other plants that are in that family too, and they're just all about darkness because they're nightshades and fear. So this was a remedy that's very unusual. Most people don't even know about it. And there's a lot of fear involved, but it is matched with a certain amount of bravery as well. So, you can imagine anyone who's in the military is brave, and they have to be. So that was an interesting story, and he got much better when I switched him over to that remedy. I mean, he was better with that first one, but he got much better switching over to that remedy.
So does it almost work with our chemistry? Is that what it does? Is it working with our chemistry, or is it filling us with something that our body doesn't have? I mean, how does this work? This is interesting.
Well, what it's doing, homeopathy means similar suffering.
Similar suffering.
That's literally what it homeo means similar, and pathy meaning suffering. So it was a phrase coined by Dr. Samuel Hahnemann, who was the founder of the principles of homeopathy back in the late 1700s and early 1800s. He was a German physician. And he was disgusted by the medical practices of the time. So he started testing drugs on himself to see what would happen.
That's brave.
And what happened, he took a dose of quinine just to see what would happen. And what happened was he got the symptoms of malaria, but he didn't get malaria. Now, we still use quinine to treat malaria in all around the world. They use quinine. And he took a dose of it to see what would happen when he didn't have quinine or didn't have malaria. And so it gave him the symptoms of malaria. You have to have the protozoa to get malaria.
Okay.
Right? You got to get the insect bite, and that transfers the protozoa into your body. So it becomes a like cures like situation. So anyone who's had a Bloody Mary for breakfast has done like cures like. You know, it's not the same thing. You didn't drink Bloody Marys the night before. Nobody drinks Bloody Marys at night almost. You know, they have beer, they have hard drinks. But the next morning, you know, they have a Bloody Mary. So that's kind of a crude form of homeopathic treatment. So are these drugs for ADHD. You know, they're Ritalin is a legal dose of speed. So if you give it to someone who doesn't have ADHD, they will develop these symptoms of not being able to focus and being hyperactive. But once if you have it, it actually, in this case, suppresses the symptoms. In homeopathy, it heals the symptoms. So that's what's going on. But underneath it all, honestly, nobody can really say what's going on.
Yeah.
Because it's, you know, you can't patent a homeopathic remedy. So.
Yeah.
Who's going to pay for something they can't patent?
Right, exactly. And, you know, and it's interesting because I just really believe that God has given us, you know, so much here on earth and, you know, and so many things to help us heal and to be healthy, you know, healthy food. And so I'm all about, you know, trying the more natural remedies. Because I know for me, I'm very sensitive to medication. Very, very sensitive to medication. When I've had surgeries and I have to take pain pills, I'm only on them like as long as I absolutely need them, and I'm off because I am so sensitive to them and I don't like the way they make me feel. And so I'm always looking for more natural ways to manage this. And I love that there are ways that help with these, you know, with these symptoms. I call them kind of symptoms. That's a natural way, and it's temporary. It's not, I'm having to take something every single day for the rest of my life in order to manage and then have symptoms or side effects from the medication that I'm taking. That's what scares me, is the side effects from the medication. And so it's really refreshing to know that there's these remedies out there that, you know, again, they're temporary and they're very effective. And so so if someone's taking it, like this gentleman you were talking about, again, he only takes it for a certain amount of time and then it helps him get through that. What happens when he stops taking that medication though?
Well, he doesn't take it every day
to
begin with. Some people who have some really serious chronic health problems might need to take a remedy every day in a real gentle, very low potency form that we gradually build up, you know, so their body can tolerate. And it's not too much for their body. But for the most part, all of the people in this study took remedies once a month.
Really? That's it?
Once a month. Yes.
That is refreshing.
Yeah. Yeah. And it just all depends on your practitioner. Some practitioners really like to do, you know, daily or weekly things. And sometimes I do that too. It just depends on what's going on, what else is going on with the client. If it's only physical symptoms, you don't have to be as concerned. But, you know, if there are or only mental emotional symptoms, excuse me. If there are only mental and emotional symptoms, you don't need to give it as often, and you don't need to worry about dosing them too high. But if there's a lot of physical symptoms, like let's say they have eczema, which is not uncommon in people who have PTSD because they've taken a lot of medications to manage it, and it messes up their liver.
So, but again, they only take it for a certain amount of time. It's not something that they do forever, right?
Some people might have to do it forever, but if you have to take pellets once a month, it's not
a big deal. And it's not going to do all the damage to your body that some of the other medications could possibly do,
Right.
or not taking medication. Because I know trauma, there is a physical aspect to it as well. And so,
Yes.
So interesting. Okay.
Yeah. In fact, in the study, I had a client who had a lot of eczema. And so the first thing we did was heal her liver. Before I even gave her any remedies for trauma, is we healed her liver because she had been on so many medications. And I think that, in retrospect and with more clients, I probably would have kept her on that liver remedy, once a month or something like that, or, take it for a week, once a month or something like that. But there are just, a lot of medications, and most medications go, are cleared through the body and the liver.
Yeah.
Some of them through the kidneys, but a large percentage of them is through the liver. And then if your liver's not functioning, you get skin symptoms.
And so it would be eczema. Interesting. I have eczema in my ears, which is weird. It is so weird.
I had a client just yesterday who told me that, and I've never heard it.
It is the weirdest thing, and it just literally came out of nowhere, and my ears started itching so bad. And I went to one doctor, and he gave me these ear drops, and didn't help. And I mean, it would keep me up at night. It was so incredibly itchy. And I finally went to an allergist, and he's like, "You got eczema in your ears." I'm like, "I got what? How do you do that? How do you do that?" And so there's medication that I take once in a while, but of all places, inside my ears. Our bodies are so weird sometimes. They do really weird things. So with trauma patients, do you work with a lot of patients who come from childhood abuse, trauma, that kind of thing, or is it mostly military?
No, it's anyone who has.
So you've worked with a lot of patients that have childhood abuse and trauma.
Yes.
So tell us a couple of success stories in that, because I know our listeners would love to hear that too, including me.
Okay. Well, the one I told you about with the woman who had the little grief incident, that she was a situation where she just, her childhood was very abusive, and she was put down a lot. That's what her kind of thing is. So it's just a lot of, not being good enough. The other person I told you about who had the worst case of childhood trauma that his therapist had ever heard of. What led me to his remedy was that he had a really close relationship with his grandmother. And if it hadn't been for her, who knows what his life would have been like, because his grandmother was like the saving adult in his family. And this particular remedy was known for having a close relationship with her.
Oh, how interesting. You got to know as much as a doctor.
Well, what I would say is I need to know as much as a doctor, but different than what a doctor needs
right,
to
exactly.
know.
But I mean, it's just, the different remedies. And like you say, it's layered. And I think on our call, you were talking about, you kind of mentioned on this one where sometimes, there's a lot of symptoms going on, and you have to address this one and this one first and get that calmed down before you can address all the other ones. So, I mean, that's a lot.
Right. And it's a lot to pay attention to. There's a lot of moving parts, so to speak.
Yes, that's for sure. That's for sure.
So one other one, and this wasn't childhood trauma so much, although I suspect that, there's always this susceptibility, right? She ended up marrying somebody who was just super abusive. And she was one of the EMTs. And so she got into this, thing already kind of traumatized from her spouse. And then her way of managing it was to drink a bottle of wine every day, which also affects your liver negatively, right? And so after giving her the appropriate remedy, and hers was a remedy for a lot of suppressed anger and other emotions. And she didn't need to do that anymore. She didn't need to drink. She didn't need to drink, but she could drink if she wanted to. If she just wanted to be social,
but she didn't
she
need
could.
to.
And she wasn't tripped up and feeling like once she started, she wasn't going to be able to stop or anything.
I cannot imagine, because I know in my adult life, I was in survival mode for so many years. I cannot imagine being an EMT, being in survival mode. I can't even imagine, because just my everyday life, and my life is not like an EMT, but back then it was, I was always already so stressed, right? I was always heightened stress all the time. And it didn't take much to send me, through the top and just losing it. So I cannot imagine being an EMT or a firefighter or a police officer and being under those intense situations.
Yeah, I know. I can't either. That's why I'm not one of those.
I know my limits. I know my limits for sure. What would you like to leave our listeners with?
Well, some people aren't certain whether they need help or not, or they're wondering just how bad is my PTSD. And so I put together a questionnaire, and it's based on questions from a questionnaire that was developed by the Anxiety and Depression Association, and that came from the DSM-5. So they created this questionnaire, and the questionnaire is available on my website, and they can find it at ptsdquiz.com. And it will give them some feedback on how, whether they need help or not based on their score. And then I can contact them and, see if they want to schedule something. But it's a really interesting one. And then when they sign up with me, they'll actually have a different questionnaire to fill out, which will be more complete than that one.
Yeah, that's probably just an overview.
Which will have, yes, the other one is more of an overview. This one is also has, I added into it more than just yes and no questions, because yes and no isn't particularly helpful when you're trying to see if people have improved. You also want to know, is it as good as it could be, or is it as bad as it can be? And so that's included in on that question. So if someone is, are you hypervigilant? And they can say yes or no. Well, I won't know if I don't have that other scale on there. I'm not going to know whether they've improved or not, because the answer could still be yes, but it's so much less.
Exactly. Oh yeah, definitely hypervigilance.
Yeah. So then we would be doing a different questionnaire,
and that just helps you,
and then periodically have them do
and that helps you dial in on how to treat them.
Right. And it helps them as well, so they know what has improved and what hasn't, because you would be surprised at how little people remember once.
It's true. And they'll think, oh, I haven't gotten better at all. And they do. And it's true, because, and it sounds like it's same here. Healing is not always an overnight thing. You don't wake up the next morning and it's a process. It takes time. And sometimes it feels frustrating because day by day goes by and you don't feel like, I've done any better. But then when you look back, or you do something like this, where you take a test to compare, and then you see, and it's really motivating. It's encouraging.
Yes, it is. And then you're doing the right thing. You're getting better.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I take 20 pages of notes, and I often go back and I'll ask people, how is this and how is that? And they'll say, did I really tell you that? I don't even remember that.
Wow. I bet. So it's just kind of a purge meeting too, where they're able to just kind of let it out, which is
Yeah,
important. That's really important. So you create a really
it
safe
is.
space for them
It is.
if they are able to do that.
Yes. Yes. All my clients
Yeah,
have to have a safe
definitely.
space.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah.
Well, if our listeners wanted to reach out to you, we've got that. That's one way that they could reach out to you, right? What are some other ways that they could reach out to you?
Yes. Well, I am on Facebook, Lotus Homeopathy. They can find me there. And I'm also on Instagram with Lotus Homeopathy. But the best way really is at that ptsdquiz.com, because that takes them to my website. And it takes them to the quiz, and that same page takes them also to the testimonials.
Read those testimonials. Yeah. I love this. Well,
Right.
thank you so much. This has been awesome. And I love to bring these different ways of, people can heal. And again, there's so many modalities out there, but I always highly recommend going the natural route.
Yes. Yes. Sometimes, Western medicine is there for the things that we need it for, but sometimes we really don't need it. There are other alternatives.
And I love that this is, for the
sure.
most part, temporary too. It's a temporary thing. It's not always a permanent thing.
Right.
Well, thank you so much.
Yes. Well, thank you for having me. It was really a nice conversation, and you are delightful to talk with.
Thank you. I love talking. I was the one on the my report cards. Talks too much.
Well.
Anyway, thank you so much.